Hello everyone. In an effort to improve and clarify my tutorials, in this video you will see a hopefully clearer tutorial on how to install the PSMini SD Storage Expansion board onto the PS Classic. In my last video I called this an advanced installation. It's still a difficult process if you're new to soldering, but if you have at least some soldering experience, this will be very doable for you. I'd argue it's easier to solder than the Genesis Mini's mod board that I also offer on my eBay page on my store website. And the reason I say this is because the actual soldering points aren't as small on the PS Mini than they are on the Genesis Mini's controller chip. The real difficult part of the PS Classic Minis involves lifting the middle two pins of the second USB port that could potentially result in permanent damage to the USB port if not done correctly. I've personally ripped a few pads when I started working on the board. That being said, as the tutorial goes, I'll go into what not to do in hopes of giving anyone wanting to do this installation more confidence. Don't worry, you got this. For this installation, you will need a lot of the basics for soldering. A soldering iron that doesn't have to be fancy if you don't have one, tip cleaner to keep your iron clean, soldering sponge, tweezers, X-Acto knife, isopropyl alcohol of 91% or higher, Kapton tape, Q-tips for cleaning, soldering flux, which is essential to soldering wire that is 6337 tin lead rosin core, and or soldering paste of either 138 degrees Celsius or 185 degrees Celsius. I also recommend you have something to magnify your view, such as a magnifying glass or a microscope. I personally use a Tomlov DM9 Max, which has been more than adequate for the job. Before getting started, if you plan on using Project Eris, you want to flash your console before anything if you haven't done so already. Project Eris needs to be flashed onto the console, unlike AutoBleem, which can be directly read from the microSD card. That being said, you can still use AutoBleem even if your console is flashed with Project Eris, which gives you the option to use either whenever you want. Consider flashing your console ahead of time if you feel you have a remote reason to want to use it in the future. The reason for needing to flash your Mini before installing the board is that the PS Mini doesn't read the second USB port from the storage board's hub until software like Project Eris or AutoBleem tells it to do so. Technically, when you mod your Mini's USB port, natively you don't have a second USB port, so keep this in mind. On to the installation. Step 1, of course, is to separate the shell from the board. There are 5 screws on the bottom of the shell that you can remove with a small Phillips screwdriver, and another 4 screws on the inside. Once you have these out, you can lift the board out of the shell and push up on the heat shield to remove it. Step 2 is adhesive removal. Every component on the PS Classic Mini has adhesive, and it makes it easier to solder when you have the adhesive dissolved. Orient the board with the USB ports facing away from you. Tape down the tiny resistors just past the USB ports. Take a Q-tip soaked in isopropyl alcohol and dab it on the 4 pins of the Player 2's USB port. You can do it a couple of times to soak the pins as needed. Give it a minute and then take your X-Acto knife and scrape the sides and top of each pin. You will notice some of the adhesive gather at the tip of your knife. You don't need to apply too much pressure when scraping the adhesive, and you don't want to cut into the traces. For the top of the pins, I like to score them a bit with my knife, which helps with adhering solder in the next step. Step 3 is lifting the middle legs. This step is pretty important, so go over these instructions a couple of times if you're not sure. The goal for this step is to raise the 2 middle legs of the second USB port. Start by adding a bit of solder to the top of all 4 legs. This will reflow the pins on the pads and will allow you to better heat the legs and let you add solder to it a bit easier. While you will only be lifting the 2 in the middle, the solder on the other 2 pins will help you for the steps after this. Take your X-Acto knife and angle it against the back of the USB port until you are able to get behind the second leg. You'll have a good grip on it once you notice that if you attempt to turn the knife, you'll feel resistance. Once you have a good grip on it, take your iron with your other hand and let it heat the bottom of the leg on the main board. While the heat is being applied, take your X-Acto knife and gently start to turn the knife outwards. This will lift the leg off the pad on the main board. You want to lift it off the pad and nothing more. Do not apply too much force to your knife. You don't need a lot of force to lift the leg. Doing so could potentially break the leg, or worse, if there's not enough heat, you can rip the pad off the main board, so take your time with it. Do the same with the other leg in the middle. Again, take your knife, Position it behind the leg, heat it, and turn. With enough heat, you'll see the legs start to lift and turn upwards. After this, take your tweezers and gently lift the legs further up. Once you have this part done, congratulations, you've done the hardest part of the installation. Step 4 is mounting the board. You will be aligning the board at 4 different spots. The 3 mounting holes on the top right go into the ground plane near the screw hole. The 4 pads should align with the 4 legs and pads of the USB port. The mounting hole on the left should align with the round grounding point, and the mounting hole nearest to you should align with the long ground plane. When you have all these aligned, you'll want to tape down your board with your Kapton tape. Make sure it is secured so it doesn't move. You can start by mounting the point nearest to you by either feeding a lot of soldering wire into it or using soldering paste. Use a lot of heat and a lot of flux, as it sometimes takes a while for the solder to adhere to the copper. You'll then do the same with the other mounting points. Step 5 is soldering the USB pads and legs to the board. This is where magnifying glass or microscope comes handy. You can use soldering paste or soldering wire for this step. Personally, I found soldering wire to be cleaner and flows a little better while giving you more control, with less of a mess to clean up later. I recently did an installation with soldering wire but messed up and didn't set my microscope to record, so the best I have is a messy soldering paste installation. You can use either, just make sure to use a lot of flux. But as stated in this example, I use soldering paste, so start by putting down some flux and then dabbing a little bit of paste on the pad and heat it so it flows down. You don't need to do anything too fancy, just apply heat and a little bit of solder at a time to have enough of it flow onto the leg or pad. Just don't put too much soldering paste as much as I did on this one. It does end up making a mess. If you're using soldering wire, slowly feed the solder until you see it make contact with the main board. The middle 2 pads are tricky because of the 2 raised legs in your view, so do your best to apply solder to these 2. One trick to double checking is by letting it cool and then applying heat to the pad. If you notice that the solder on the main board slowly turns shiny by having heat on the pad on the storage board, you'll know it's making contact. You will be doing this for all 4 pads on the storage board to their respective soldering points and should look something like this after it's said and done. You're aiming to solder the pads on the storage board to the pads of the USB port. Here's another example from another installation I performed. Again, you don't need a lot of solder. Less is more in this case, especially if you don't want to do a lot of cleanup. It is important to note that while you are doing this step, do not touch the back of the USB port itself. It is made out of plastic and will melt rather quickly. Worse yet, if you melt too much of it, it can also potentially loosen the pin and will cause the pin to get pushed out when you insert a USB device like a controller in the port. Step 6 is performing a power mod. I used to call this an optional step, but it's something I now require for everyone to do just because I've had many customers say their PS Classic isn't reading their card, and every single time it was due to the inadequate amount of power being delivered to the SD card slot. Whatever the reason was didn't matter, but I do know the PS Classic is a very finicky piece of hardware when it comes to power, so a power mod is just something I feel is perfectly fine to do. Take your magnifying glass or microscope and find these 2 resistors next to the player 1 USB port. Then with a little bit of flux and some solder, bridge the 2 together as shown. You don't want a big glob on there, you just want enough to bridge the 2 together. Next, on the player 2 side, find these 2 resistors and bridge them as shown. Again, you don't want a huge glob, but just enough. Given how small these are, soldering is more touch and go, or else you can pull them off the board if you apply too much heat. Step 7 is soldering the wires. Start by prepping the wires by stripping the ends and adding solder to them. Be sure to use flux. You will want to reduce the length of them since the distance isn't that great. I'll leave this part up to you. Prep the data pads by using a bit of flux on them and adding a bit of solder to them. Then, take one of the included wires and solder it onto the pad. You'll then want to prep the legs by doing the same, adding flux and then some solder. This will make it easier for the wires to adhere. Take your tweezers and guide the wire to the appropriate leg and repeat for the other data pad using the other included wire. Please note, I've had 2 main versions of this board, a version 2.2 and a version 2.3. If you have a version 2.2, the wires will need to be crossed. If you have a version 2.3, the wires will go straight. Please check the back of your board to see what version you have. One added step, There is a metal leg on the heat shield that you will want to cut in order for the heat shield to sit comfortably again. You can either cut it or bend it until it rips off. After that, it should be good. And that's it. The hardware installation at this point is finished. From here, it's a choice of software and content you wish to add. Keep in mind that for Project Eris, your card can be formatted to ext4, NTFS, or exFAT and named Sony in all caps. For AutoBleem, you'll want to format your card to FAT32 and name your card Sony in all caps. Please refer to their installation guides for help. The quickest way to add content is always going to be having your card in your PC and copying files over. You do have to do this as there's no way to sync your content through the USB port as there is for other minis, such as using Hackshi on an SNES Mini. As a quick demonstration, I have loaded AutoBleem onto my card and added one of my favorites, Pandemonium. As a side note, I do own this game and ripped it myself. I take my card and place it into the slot. On boot, the green light blinks and AutoBleem comes up. Find that your game is there, and it's simple as choosing what you want to play, just as any game that was natively on it. From here, how you configure your Mini or what you add to it is going to be all up to you. As for other ideas I've fiddled with for this console, some of you may have noticed a power pad while I was showing video of the board being mounted. The board in question was from a prototype that had another USB port, since the PSMini natively supports 4 ports. It's not a wildly new idea, since my original video also showcased a second variant of the board with the exact same USB port. Those never went into production simply because the way the PS Classic allocates power leaves very little to use for another USB port. Like I said, the PS Mini's hardware is very finicky with how it distributes power, even with the power mod. In this case, what would end up happening with the older board with the third USB port, you would connect 2 controllers in the front connected with the micro SD card occupied. Connecting a third controller would randomly disable the second USB port, leaving you with just 2 controllers again. I also tried a USB wireless dongle that actually connected to my network but operated at a very slow speed. Overall, the extra USB port wasn't doing what I wanted it to do, so I scrapped it. Until recently, where I thought I could bypass the power before it gets filtered, I could potentially get more out of it. So I made a version of the board with a dedicated power pad that connected to the 5-volt plane of the PS Mini. I managed to get 3 PS Mini controllers to work via RetroArch. However, adding the controller dongle from 8BitDo ended up with my PS Mini's USB controller to overheat and blow a hole in it. While I like the idea of having another usable port, the unpredictability of what people may use it for and permanently bricking their Mini was something I was not comfortable with people having. Right now, I'm looking at ways to externally power the USB port because I do think that is doable. So I'll have more on that in the future, hopefully. Overall, I hope this video shows a clearer way to install the PS Mini's SD Storage Expander and gives people more confidence in installing them. So hope you guys enjoy.